HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gustav Sonata, a novel, by Rose Tremain. Read by Derek Perkins. If anyone should importune me to give a reason why I loved him, I feel it could not otherwise be expressed than by making the answer, because it was he, because it was I. Michel de Montaigne, On Friendship. Part 1. Mutti. Matzlingen, Switzerland, 1947. At the age of 5, Gustav Perle was certain of only one thing. He loved his mother. Her name was Emilie, but everybody addressed her as Frau Perle. In Switzerland at that time, after the war, people were formal. You might pass a lifetime without knowing the first name of your nearest neighbor. Gustav called Emilie Perle Mutti. She would be Mutti all his life, even when the name began to sound babyish to him. His Mutti, his alone. A thin woman with a reedy voice and straggly hair, and a hesitant way of moving from room to room in the small apartment, as if afraid of discovering, between one space and the next, objects or even people she had not prepared herself to encounter. The second-floor apartment, reached by a stone staircase too grand for the building, overlooked the river Emma in the town of Matzlingen, in an area of Switzerland known as Mittelland, between the Jura and the Alps. On the wall of Gustav's tiny room was a map of Mittelland, which displayed itself as hilly and green and populated by cattle and water-wheels and little shingled churches. Sometimes Emilie would take Gustav's hand and guide it to the north bank of the river where Matzlingen was marked in. The symbol for Matzlingen was a wheel of cheese with one slice cut out of it. Gustav could remember asking Emilie who had eaten the slice that had been cut out. But Emilie had told him not to waste her time with silly questions. On an oak sideboard in the living room stood a photograph of Erich Perle, Gustav's father, who had died before Gustav was old enough to remember him. Every year, on August the 1st, Swiss National Day, Emilie set poses of gentian flowers round the photograph and made Gustav kneel down in front of it and pray for his father's soul. Gustav didn't understand what a soul was. He could see only that Erich was a good-looking man with a confident smile, wearing a police uniform with shiny buttons. So Gustav decided to pray for the buttons, that they would keep their shine, and that his father's proud smile wouldn't fade as the years passed. He was a hero, Emilie would remind her son every year. I didn't understand it at first, but he was. He was a good man in a rotten world. If anybody tells you otherwise, they're wrong. Sometimes, with her eyes closed and her hands pressed together, she would mumble other things she remembered about Erich. One day she said, "It was so unfair. Justice was never done, and it never will be done." Wearing a smock, with his short hair neatly combed, Gustav was taken each morning to the local kindergarten. At the door of the schoolhouse, he would stand absolutely still, watching Emilie walk away down the path. He never cried. He could often feel a cry trying to come up from his heart, but he always forced it down, because this was how Emilie had told him to behave in the world. He had to master himself. The world was alive with wrongdoing, she said, but Gustav had to emulate his father, who, when wronged, had behaved like an honorable man. He had mastered himself. In this way, Gustav would be prepared for the uncertainties to come, because even in Switzerland, where the war hadn't trespassed, nobody yet knew how the future would unfold. "So you see," she said, "you have to be like Switzerland. Do you understand me? You have to hold yourself together and be courageous. Stay separate and strong. Then you will have the right kind of life." Gustav had no idea what the right kind of life was. All he knew was the life he had, the one with Emilie in the second-floor apartment, with the map of Mittelland on his bedroom wall, and Emilia's stockings drying on a string above the iron bath. He wanted them always to be there, those stockings. He wanted the taste and texture of the knödel they ate for supper never to change. Even the smell of cheese in Emilia's hair, which he didn't particularly like. He knew this had to linger there because Emilia's job at the Matzlingen Cheese Cooperative was the thing that kept them alive. The specialty of the Matzlingen Cooperative was Emmental, made from the milk of the Emma valleys. Sounding like a tour guide, Emilie announced to Gustav, "There are many fine inventions in Switzerland, and Emmental cheese is one of them. But, in spite of its fineness, the sales of Emmental, both within Switzerland and to all those countries outside it, still struggling to rebuild themselves after the war, were unreliable. And if sales were down, the bonuses paid to the cheese workers at Christmas and on National Day could be disappointing. Waiting to see what her bonus was going to be would put Emilie Perle into a trance of anxiety. She would sit at the kitchen shelf. It wasn't a table, just a shelf on a hinge, where she and Gustav sat to eat their meals, doing her sums on the grey edges of the Matzlinger Zeitung, the local newspaper. The newsprint always blurred her arithmetic. Nor did her figures keep to their columns, but wandered over the reportage of Schwingen competitions and the sightings of wolves in the nearby forests. Sometimes the hectic scribblings were blurred a second time by Emilia's tears. She told Gustav never to cry, but it seemed that this rule didn't apply to her, because there were times, late at night, when Gustav would creep out of his room to find Emilie weeping over the pages of the Matzlinger Zeitung. At these moments, her breath often smelled of aniseed, and she would be clutching a glass clouded with yellow liquid, and Gustav felt afraid of these things, of her aniseed breath and the dirty glass and his mother's tears. He would climb onto a stool beside her and watch her out of the corner of his grey eyes, and soon Emilie would blow her nose and reach out to him and say she was sorry. He would kiss her moist, burning cheek, and then she would lift him up, staggering a little under the weight of him, and carry him back to his room. But in the year that Gustav turned 5, no Christmas bonuses were paid at all, and Emilie was forced to take a second job on Saturday mornings as a cleaner in the Protestant church of St. Johann. She said to Gustav, "This is work you can help me with." So they went out together very early, before the town was properly awake, before any light showed in the sky. They walked through the snow, following 2 frail torchlight beams, their breath condensing inside their woolen mufflers. When they arrived at the church, this, too, was dark and cold. Emilie turned on the 2 greenish strip lights on either side of the nave, and they began their tasks, tidying the hymn books, dusting the pews, sweeping the stone floor, polishing the brass candlesticks. They could hear owls calling outside in the waning dark. As the daylight grew stronger, Gustav always returned to his favourite task. Kneeling on a hassock, pushing the hassock along as he went, he'd clean the iron grating that ran down the length of the aisle. He pretended to Emilie that he had to do this job very carefully, because the ironwork had ornate patterns in it, and his rag had to go round these and in and out of them. And she said, "All right, Gustav, that's good. Doing your job carefully is good." But what she didn't know was that Gustav was searching for objects which had fallen through the grating, and which lay there in the dust. He thought of this strange collection as his treasure. Only hands as small as his could retrieve them. Now and again he did find money, But it was always the kind of low-value money with which nothing could be bought. More usual items were hairpins, withered flower petals, cigarette stubs, sweet wrappings, paper clips, and nails made of iron. He knew that these things were of no account, but he didn't mind. One day he found a brand-new lipstick in a golden case. He designated this his chief treasure. He took everything home in the pockets of his coat and hid the object in a wooden box that had once contained the cigars his father used to smoke. He smoothed out the sweet wrappers, liking the vibrant colors, and shook out the tobacco from the cigarette ends into a little tin. When he was alone in his room, he would stare at the treasure. Sometimes he touched it and smelled it. Keeping it hidden from Emilie, as though perhaps it was a present for her which he would one day surprise her with, was what excited him about it. The lipstick was a dark purple color, almost black, like a boiled damson, and he found it beautiful. He and Emilie had to spend 2 hours at the church to get everything shipshape for the weekend services. During this time, a few people would come in, bundled up against the cold, and enter the pews and pray, or else go to the altar rail and stare at the amber-coloured stained-glass Pietà in the west window. Gustav saw that Emilie crept round them, as if trying to make herself invisible. Seldom did these people say "Cruelty" or say Frau Perle's name. He watched them from his hassock. He noticed that almost all of them were old. They appeared to him as unfortunate beings who had no secret treasure. He thought that, perhaps, they hadn't got the right kind of life. He wondered whether the right life might lie in the things which he alone could see, the things underneath some grating or other, over which most people heedlessly trod. When the cleaning was done, Gustav and Emilie walked home, side by side. The trams would be running by then, and a bell chiming somewhere, and a scatter of pigeons fluttering from roof to roof, and the flower stall-holder setting out her vases and buckets on the corner of Unter der Egg. The flower-seller, whose name was Frau Teller, would always greet them and smile, even if snow was falling. Unter der Egg was the name of the street in which their apartment block stood. Before these blocks had been built, Unter der Egg, under the harrow, had been a rural strip where the residents of Matzlingen had been able to rent allotments and grow vegetables, but these were long gone. Now there was just a wide pavement and a metal drinking fountain and Frau Teller's stall, which was the last reminder of green things growing in this place. Emilie sometimes said that she would have liked to grow vegetables. Red cabbages, she said, and snow peas and marrows. But at least, she would sigh, the place wasn't destroyed by the war. She had shown Gustav some magazine pictures of destroyed places. She said they were all outside Switzerland. Dresden, Berlin, Caen. There were no people in any of these photographs, but in one of the pictures there had been a white dog sitting alone in a mound of rubble. Gustav asked what had happened to that dog, and Emilie said, "It's no use asking what happened, Gustav. Perhaps the dog found a good master, or perhaps it died of hunger. How can I possibly know? Everything in the war depended on who you were and where you were, and then destiny took over." Gustav stared at his mother. "Where were we?" he said. She closed the magazine and folded it away, like a soft garment she planned to wear again in the near future. She took Gustav's face in her hands. "We were here," she said, "safe in Matzlingen, even had a beautiful apartment in Fribourgstrasse. It had a balcony where I grew geraniums. I can't see a geranium plant without thinking of the ones I grew." "Then we came to Unter der Egg?" asked Gustav. "Yes, then we came to Unter der Egg." "Just you and me?" No, at first there were the three of us, but not for long. After the cleaning of the church, Gustav and Emilie would sit at the folding shelf in the tiny kitchen and drink hot chocolate and eat black bread with butter. The long winter day stretched ahead of them, cold and empty. Sometimes Emilie would go back to bed and read her magazines. She made no apology for this. She said children had to learn to play on their own. She said if they didn't learn to do this, they would never cultivate an imagination. Gustav would stare out of the window of his room at the white sky. The only toy he owned was a little metal train, so he'd set the train on the windowsill and shunt it backwards and forwards. Often it was so cold by the window that Gustav's breath made realistic steam, which he puffed over the engine. At the carriage windows, people's faces had been painted on, all of them given expressions of blank surprise. To these startled people, Gustav would occasionally whisper, "You have to master yourselves." The strangest place in the apartment building was the bunker underneath it. This had been built as a nuclear shelter, more usually referred to as an air protection cellar. Soon every building in Switzerland would be required to have one of these. Once a year the janitor summoned the residents of the building, including the children, and they descended all together into the shelter. Behind them, as they went down the stairs, heavy iron doors were closed. Gustav clung to Emilia's hand. Lights were turned on, but all they showed were more stairs going down and down. The janitor always reminded everybody that they should breathe normally, that the air filtration system was tested frequently for its absolutely perfect functioning. It wasn't, he said, called an air protection cellar for nothing. But there was a strange smell about it, an animal smell, as though foxes or rats had nested here, living off dust or off grey paint licked from the walls. Beneath the countless stairs, the shelter opened into a large storeroom, stacked from floor to ceiling with sealed cardboard boxes. "You'll remember what we keep in the boxes," the janitor said. "Enough food for all of us for approximately 2 months, and the water supply will be in the tanks over there. Clean drinking water. Rationed, of course, because the main supply, even if it was functioning, would be disconnected in case of radiation contamination, but sufficient for all." He led them on. He was a heavy man. He spoke loudly and emphatically, as though he assumed he was with a party of deaf people. The sound of his voice echoed round the concrete walls. Gustav noticed that the residents always fell silent during the nuclear shelter tours. Their expressions reminded him of the painted people on his train. Husbands and wives huddled together. Old people clutched at each other to steady themselves. Gustav always hoped that his mother wouldn't let go of his hand. When they got to the dormitory part of the shelter, Gustav saw that the bunks had been built one above the other in stacks of 5. To reach the top bunks, you had to climb a ladder, and he thought that he wouldn't like this, to be so far from the ground. Supposing he woke in the night, in the dark, and couldn't find Mutti? Supposing Mutti was on the very bottom bunk, or in a different row? Supposing he fell out of his bunk and landed on his head and his head exploded? He whispered that he didn't want to live there, in an iron bunk and with cardboard food. And Mutti said, "It will probably never happen." "What will never happen?" he asked. But Emilie didn't wish to say. "You don't need to think about it yet," she told him. "The shelter is just a place of safety, in case the Russians, or anybody at all, ever took it into their heads to harm Switzerland." Gustav lay in his bed at night and thought about what might happen if Switzerland were harmed. He wondered if Matzlingen would be turned to rubble, and whether he would find himself all alone, like the white dog in the picture. Anton. Matzlingen, 1948. Anton arrived at the kindergarten in the cold spring of the year. He came into the schoolroom and stood by the door, crying. None of the children had seen this boy before. One of the teachers, Fräulein Frick, went to him and took his hand and knelt down and began talking to him, but he didn't seem to hear her. He just kept on weeping. Fräulein Frick beckoned to Gustav. Gustav didn't particularly want to be the boy chosen to comfort this weeping child, but Fräulein Frick urged him to come towards her and said to Anton, "This is Gustav. Gustav is going to be your friend. He will take you to the sandbox and you can build a castle together before we begin our lessons." Anton looked down at Gustav, who was slightly smaller than he was. Gustav said to him, "My mother says it's better not to cry. She says you have to master yourself." Anton appeared so startled by this that his sobbing stopped abruptly. "There," said Fräulein Frick. "That's good. Go with Gustav, then." She produced a handkerchief and wiped Anton's cheeks. The boy's face was a hectic pink, his eyes big pools of darkness. His body was trembling. Gustav led him over to the sandbox. Anton's small hand felt burning hot. Gustav said, "What kind of castle do you want to build?" But the boy couldn't answer. So Gustav gave him a spade and said, "I like castles with moats. Shall we start on the moat?" Gustav marked out a circle and they began digging. A few other children clustered round them, staring at the new boy. Before Anton arrived, Gustav had had no close friends at the kindergarten. There was a girl who amused him called Isabel. She liked to climb onto the work tables and jump off again, landing like a gymnast with her feet together and her arms outspread. She always brought her pet mouse to school in a wooden cage, and Gustav was one of the few children allowed to stroke the mouse. But Isabel was too exhausting to play with for long. She had to be the queen of every game. All his life, Gustav would remember vividly that first morning spent with Anton. They didn't talk very much. It was as if Anton was so exhausted by his weeping that he couldn't talk. He just followed Gustav around and sat very close to him at the work table and watched what he did and tried to copy him. When Gustav asked him where he'd come from, he said, "From Bern. We had a house in Bern, but now we've only got an apartment in Matzlingen." Gustav said, "The place where I live is very small. We don't even have a kitchen table. Have you got a kitchen table?" "Yes," said Anton. "We've got a kitchen table. I was sick all over it at breakfast because I didn't want to come here." Later, Anton asked Gustav, "Have you got a piano?" "No," said Gustav. "We've got a piano and I can play it. I can play Fiorelisa. Not the fast bit, but the first section." "What's Fiorelisa?" asked Gustav. "Beethoven," said Anton. Perhaps it was the idea of Anton playing the piano with his small hands, or perhaps it was when Anton told him that his surname was Zweibel, which was identical to the word for onion and made you feel sorry for him. Whatever it was, there was something about Anton which made Gustav feel that he had to protect him. The following day, Anton was crying again when he arrived. Gustav saw Fräulein Frick coming towards him, but he stood in her way and said that Anton would be all right with him. He led him to the nature table and showed him the silkworms that were being reared in a grocery box with a perforated lid. He said, "In the box we had before, the holes were too big and the silkworms climbed out of them." "Where did they go?" asked Anton through his tears. "They went all over the place," said Gustav. "We tried to find them and put them back, but some of them got trodden on. Treading on a silkworm is disgusting." Gustav saw Anton smile, but then his tears welled up again, and he put his face in his hands. Gustav said, "What are you crying for?" Anton stammered that he was crying for the loss of his friends at his old kindergarten in Bern. "Are they dead?" asked Gustav. "No, but I'll never see them again. I'm in this place now." Gustav said, "I think it's stupid to cry for them, then. Isn't your mother angry that you keep crying?" Anton took his hands away from his face and stared at Gustav. "No," he said. "She understands that I'm unhappy." "Well," said Gustav, "I think it's a bit stupid. You're here now, so you just have to get on with it." The bell rang for the beginning of morning lessons. Anton followed Gustav to one of the work tables. Pieces of grey sugar paper were put in front of them, and boxes of crayons, and they were told to start the day by drawing a picture of anything they liked. Anton's tears slowly speckled the paper like fat raindrops, but after 5 or 6 minutes he stopped crying. "What are you going to draw?" he asked Gustav. "I'm going to draw my mother," he said. "Is your mother beautiful?" "I don't know. She's just my mother. She works at the cheese cooperative, making Emmental." Fräulein Frick rapped on her desk with a ruler. "You know the rules," she said. "When we're drawing pictures, we're silent. We talk silently to our pictures, not to each other." Gustav wanted Emilie to be sitting at the kitchen shelf in his picture, so he drew the shelf first, a kind of oblong, resting on air. He coloured it brown. Then he began on Emilia's face, not a round thing, but a narrow kind of shape he didn't know how to make. He saw straight away that what he'd drawn was too narrow. He put his hand up, and Fräulein Frick came over, and Gustav said, "This was meant to be a face, but it looks like an ice cream cone." "Never mind," said Fräulein Frick. "Why don't you make it a cone? Put some nice strawberry ice cream into it." There was something amusing about this, that Emilie Perle could suddenly become a cornet. Gustav whispered to Anton, "I was going to draw my Mutti, but she went wrong. Now she's an ice cream." And this was the first time that he heard Anton laugh. And it was the kind of laugh that couldn't be resisted. You had to join in, and suddenly the two boys couldn't stop giggling. Gustav suspected that Fräulein Frick was watching them sternly, but she said nothing, and when he looked up at her, mastering his giggling at last, her expression wasn't stern at all, but just rather sweetly amused. Gustav selected a pink crayon and drew a scribble of ice cream on his cornet. Then he looked over to see what Anton was drawing. He was using only a black crayon. He'd laid a small ruler on the sugar paper and drawn a line all the way round it. Inside the perfectly ruled shape was a series of black lines of differing lengths. Gustav knew what the thing was meant to be. It was a piano. Gustav told Emilie about Anton's laugh. He said, "I like hearing it." In the night, he began trying to think up funny stories to tell Anton, so that he'd be able to hear his laughter all through the day. And then he had an idea which surprised him. He decided to show Anton the treasure in the cigar box. He would show him because he thought that Anton would see that it was a collection worth hoarding. But Gustav wouldn't risk taking it into the kindergarten. He said to Emilie, "Could we invite Anton Zweibel for tea?" "Zweibel?" said Emilie. "That's a very peculiar name." "He can't help his name," said Gustav. "No, but names are important. When I first met your father and he told me his surname was Perle, I thought how beautiful it was, and how I would like to become Frau Perle." Gustav looked up at his mother. She was undoing her scraggly hair from the red handkerchief she tied it in for work, letting her hair fall round her face. Then she smoothed it and patted it, as if, right then and there, she was preparing once again for that first meeting with a man called Erich Perle. "On a Wednesday we could invite him," said Gustav. "On your half-day off." "Anton Zweibel. Well, I've never heard a name like that before, but...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?